Hey ChatGPT. Today, I'd like to explore the tension between experiential knowledge and skepticism with you. On the one hand, the accumulated experiences of a society contain a vast amount of knowledge and information. Even if people often can't explain why something works a certain way, their experiential knowledge is still often quite reliable. Especially when it comes to long-standing questions and problems, the experiential values of a society have been filtered and refined through countless iterations of trial and error. So, by following the experience-based wisdom of the past, one's actions often lead to better outcomes than if one tried to figure everything out independently. On the other hand, experiential knowledge often carries a fair amount of useless baggage that could easily be discarded. Moreover, changes in technology, behavior, or even nature itself can render a certain experiential value suddenly obsolete. But since people cannot rationally explain how their experiential knowledge works, they are helpless in the face of such changes. They simply notice that things no longer turn out the way they used to and must again slowly and laboriously develop better behavioral patterns through trial and error. In such cases, one is often much better off if one is used to thinking everything through independently. One then understands why one does something in a particular way and can discard unnecessary baggage or take changes in the environment into account. What have other philosophers said about this dilemma? How did they deal with it?
From a philosophical perspective, there is indeed a long-standing debate about the role that inherited experiential knowledge, tradition, habit, on the one hand, and independent reasoning, skeptical questioning, rationalism, on the other, should play. Many philosophers have addressed this issue, often as part of broader discussions about knowledge, epistemology, progress, and society. Here is a summary of key positions on the matter. 1. The value of tradition. Many philosophers, such as Burke and Oakeshott, emphasize that inherited practices often contain a kind of elusive wisdom that cannot easily be replaced by pure theory. Especially organically developed structures are capable of solving highly complex problems that are not readily grasped through rational analysis. 2. The necessity of questioning. At the same time, many thinkers, Descartes, Kant, Bacon, reject the idea of uncritically accepting traditions. They advocate the use of one's own reason, rationalism, or systematic methods, empiricism, in order to identify and discard nonsensical or outdated elements. 3. Balancing experience and reason. From Aristotle to modern pragmatists like John Dewey, there is the view that practical experience and theoretical reflection must mutually inform one another. Leaning too far to either side tends to result in dogmatism, clinging blindly to the old, or naive utopianism, flawed reform ideas without grounding in real-world practice. 4. Change is a test case. When the environment changes, be it technologically, socially, or ecologically, the limits of mere tradition become apparent. Inherited practices come under pressure when new conditions emerge. Those who act out of habit are often caught off guard, while reflective approaches, which understand why something works, tend to be more adaptable. All in all, philosophers have placed emphasis on different aspects of the issue. But the core dilemma, between tradition and collective social experience on the one hand, and rational scrutiny and skepticism on the other, is one of the oldest and still most relevant topics in philosophy. Every era must grapple anew with finding the right balance between preserving and renewing.
Thank you for this overview. It's a good starting point. But it's not quite what I'm looking for yet. If we now consider points 1 and 2 from your summary, we immediately notice a tension. Point 1 says that organically evolved structures often contain a kind of hard-to-grasp wisdom. Point 2, however, urges us to examine traditions using our own reason and to discard outdated rules and patterns of behavior. But how am I supposed to know whether a given tradition is merely useless baggage, or whether it's actually a small part of some larger hard-to-grasp mechanism that produces good effects in ways still unknown to us? Perhaps I'm wishing for the impossible, but I'm looking for some kind of meta-rule, a principle that could help both individuals and societies to distinguish the wheat from the chaff among their inherited traditions.
A central difficulty truly lies in the fact that many traditions cannot be broken down into simple cause and effect relationships that would immediately reveal their benefit. Often, they work indirectly or through complex interactions that are not easily understood rationally. What follows are some philosophical approaches to the kind of meta-rule you're looking for, without claiming to offer a perfect, all-solving method. 1. Pragmatism, social experimentation according to John Dewey. Premise: traditions are hypotheses about what works. We should not regard them as untouchable, but rather as provisional rules of practice that have proven themselves over time. Wherever possible, we should modify traditions gradually or test them in limited contexts, social experimentation, rather than discarding them blindly or overturning them radically. Assessment: if a tradition truly has a hard-to-detect benefit, an abrupt break will be risky. It's better to critically modify partial aspects first and observe whether outcomes improve or worsen. This respects the possibility of an unseen benefit while remaining open to continuous improvement. If an effect is positive, the change can be retained. If clearly harmful, it can be reversed. 2. Popper and the Open Society, critical openness as a meta-rule. Core idea: instead of cementing traditions forever, it is essential that they remain open to critique. In principle, everything can be questioned. Every tradition must be able to withstand open debate. A taboo against criticism is dangerous. It is crucial for a society to have mechanisms, media, parliaments, civic associations, academies, public discourse, in which traditions can be freely reflected upon and criticized. In such an open environment, it becomes apparent relatively quickly whether certain practices are broadly perceived as meaningful or not. 3. Hermeneutics and understanding meaning, Hans-Georg Gadamer. Core idea: traditions often derive their meaning from a specific historical horizon. In order to evaluate them, one must understand how they came about and what function they originally served. This means investigating when, where, and under what conditions did this practice prove useful. Was it rooted in economic, climatic, religious, or political circumstances that no longer apply? If so, the likelihood that it is still useful decreases. One must also ask whether there are core values or functions, e.g., social bonding, identity formation, that the tradition continues to fulfill today. Assessment: those who truly understand why a tradition emerged and what it accomplishes can make better informed decisions about whether and how it remains useful. This allows one to separate superficial aspects, dispensable rituals, from essential ones, binding values. 4. Genealogy and power analysis, Michel Foucault. Approach: some traditions may appear useful, but in fact are part of historical power structures that privilege certain groups while disadvantaging others. One must ask, how was this tradition introduced, by whom, and whose interests did it serve? Behind a seemingly benign or even beneficial practice, there may lie mechanisms of discipline or exclusion. Even if the tradition was once useful, it may now only perpetuate outdated power relations. Assessment: Foucault's perspective helps reveal the hidden ideological content of what appears to be a merely well-established habit. The result is often a critical deconstruction, followed by the question of whether the tradition should be reformulated or discarded. 5. Summary. The following approaches can help distinguish the wheat from the chaff in the realm of tradition. Critical openness, Popper, Kant, enlightenment: nothing is sacred, every tradition may be questioned, critiqued, and tested. Gradual, pragmatic reform, Dewey: a cautious approach to deeply rooted practices we don't fully understand, prefer experimental reform over sudden revolution. Hermeneutic depth, Gadamer: understand where a tradition comes from and what its original or current meaning is. Power and genealogy critique, Foucault: ask whether a tradition serves legitimate ends or conceals power interests. So, while we may not have a single, universal rule that can once and for all decide the fate of every tradition, we do have methods that allow us to examine, adapt, or discard traditions through an ongoing process. This process must be repeated again and again, it's never truly finished.
These are very good suggestions. These 4 meta rules would probably already prevent the majority of harmful abolitions or reforms, as well as the majority of harmful preservations of traditions. Are there any other meta rules from other philosophers on this topic?
There are indeed several other philosophical or meta-theoretical approaches that propose additional rules or heuristics for critically evaluating traditions, without carelessly discarding valuable achievements. Here are a few additions to the 4 meta-rules mentioned earlier. 1. Chesterton's fence: understand first, then tear down. G.K. Chesterton coined a metaphor that is often cited in this context. If you come across a fence in the road and cannot see the use of it, you should not destroy it until you know why it was put there in the first place. One must first determine why a tradition was established before dismantling it. What problem was it originally meant to solve? Only when it's clear that the old problem truly no longer exists, or can be solved in a better way, can the tradition be abolished or altered in good conscience. 2. MacIntyre and the role of traditions in virtue ethics. In his work After Virtue, Alasdair MacIntyre argues that traditions often transmit values. So we should ask, does this tradition support the communal development of virtues, that is, a good life? Does the tradition involve a practice that cultivates internal goods, e.g., solidarity, character formation, pride and craftsmanship? Or is it merely held together by external incentives, e.g., status competition, power structures? Traditions that sustain internal goods should be preserved or at least carefully reformed. If they are merely decorative or coercive, they can be more easily discarded. 3. The Lindy effect, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. The Lindy effect states, roughly, that the longer something has lasted, the more likely it is to continue existing. Applied to traditions, the older and more enduring a practice is, the more likely it is that it possesses some kind of robust, if not easily understood, benefit. So if an institution, custom, or ritual has existed for centuries, or even millennia, and is still part of society, we should be cautious in declaring it pointless. The likelihood is relatively high that it serves some useful function. 4. Zizek and ideology critique. Slavoj Zizek emphasizes that traditional rituals and ideologies are not just rationally explainable, they also serve unconscious and emotional needs, e.g., the desire for belonging or the exclusion of others. One must therefore ask whether a seemingly benign tradition conceals a subtle ideology that supports certain power interests or manipulates collective guilt. A key question becomes, what unconscious motives or collective psychodynamics are hidden behind this custom?
I'm really starting to like this. I think we've truly found a solid approach to my problem here. 1. First of all, I note that there should always be a reason if one wants to change or abandon a tradition. If there's no reason, then there's no need to change anything at all. 2. So, if a reason does exist, the next step should be to understand the tradition. This involves a historical analysis of the tradition's origins, an inquiry into the potential problems it may be quietly solving, an exploration of the social goods it may be quietly producing, an investigation into the power interests behind its creation, spread, and preservation, who promotes it, who benefits from it, and also a look into the hidden motives of the people who maintain it. 3. Every tradition should always be in principle open to critique and questioning, but none should be dismantled before it has been understood in the way just described. 4. The older a tradition is, the more cautiously it should be handled, because very old traditions most likely have some positive effect, otherwise, they probably wouldn't have endured for so long. 5. If one concludes that a particular tradition is no longer important, it should not simply be abolished all at once. Rather, it should be modified or phased out gradually and within a limited scope. Social experimentation allows one to test changes while keeping potential harm contained. 6. I would also add that a helpful thought experiment might be to consider modernizing a tradition instead of immediately thinking about abolishing it. This approach implicitly assumes that the tradition likely contains some meaningful element, while still allowing its undesirable aspects to be addressed. It reminded me of the saying that we should not preserve the ashes, but pass on the flame.
This is great. What you've laid out here is essentially a very solid methodological guideline that draws on philosophical ideas and practical heuristics. I'll summarize it systematically and add a few notes on how these steps can interconnect. A 6-step approach to dealing with traditions. 1. No reason, no change. Core principle: if there are no problems to be solved, there's no compelling reason to overturn a tradition. Rationale: traditions often contain complex functions. Blind or purely revolutionary change can do more harm than good. 2. Historical and structural analysis. Goal: understand why the tradition emerged, who benefits from it, and what, possibly invisible, effects it produces. Practical questions. Historical origin: under what conditions did it develop? Do those conditions still exist? Problem solving: what problem did this tradition originally solve? Social function: does this tradition still offer value today that isn't immediately visible, e.g., fostering social cohesion? Power analysis: do certain groups benefit disproportionately? Is it promoted by social elites to stabilize power? Hidden motive: what emotional or psychological dynamic, e.g., identity formation, exclusion of others, pleasure and ritual, might unconsciously underlie it? 3. Principled criticizability. Core principle: traditions must never become sacred cows that are beyond all criticism. Public debates, expert discussions, and interdisciplinary perspectives, sociology, psychology, anthropology, etc., help to critically examine traditions. 4. Caution with ancient traditions. Justification: the older a tradition is, the more likely it has a hidden benefit or a deep symbolic function. 5. Gradual experimentation and safeguards. Goal: minimize negative consequences of potential changes while still allowing for reform. Strategy. Partial steps: evaluate individual elements or rituals within the tradition. Pilot projects: introduce careful changes on a small scale, e.g., in one region or group. Evaluation: collect feedback and observe whether the intended problem is solved, and whether there are unintended side effects. 6. Modernize rather than abolish, where possible. Core idea: pass on the flame rather than preserve the ashes. Approach. Identify the core: what is the meaning or underlying idea behind the custom, e.g., community, remembrance of ancestors, etc. New form: can that idea be translated into a contemporary practice? E.g., modernize rituals, adapt the form to today's way of life.
Wonderful. Thank you for this conversation and for the final summary and elaboration of the steps we've found. I believe that most individuals tend to lean either too heavily toward glorifying tradition or toward tearing down any tradition whose meaning they don't immediately understand. In that sense, most people could likely benefit from our discussion today. As for me, I intend to make an effort to better understand the meaning of traditions in the future and to conduct smaller experiments first before completely discarding any established rule of behavior. I also want to strive to preserve the flame, that is, the positive core of a tradition, even if I choose to change or abandon much of its outer form. So I've truly learned something through this conversation, and I'm already looking forward to our next philosophical exchange. Until then.
I'm glad you were able to take something away from our conversation. I'm happy to be available for another philosophical discussion whenever you'd like. Until then.